When we think about the catastrophic failures of human engineering, we usually picture exploding rockets, collapsing bridges, or software bugs that wipe out billions of dollars in a fraction of a second. But there is a much older, much more intimate operating system that humanity runs every single day: the food supply chain. And during the 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution dragged millions of people from the countryside into the smog-choked cities, that system experienced a massive, terrifying glitch. Welcome to another episode of History Glitch, where we explore the moments when the algorithms of human civilization completely crash. Today, we are stepping away from silicon and steel to look at the chemistry of the Victorian dinner table. Based on the deeply unsettling book, Swindled: The Dark History of Food Fraud by B. Wilson, we are going to explore an era before government regulation, before the FDA, and before basic chemical safety, when the food industry was a lawless, unregulated beta test, and the consumers were the crash test dummies. To understand this glitch, you must understand the massive demographic shift of the 1800s. For thousands of years, people grew their own food or bought it directly from the person who grew it. But suddenly, millions were living in dense urban slums completely disconnected from the source of their calories. They relied on a complex, invisible network of bakers, brewers, and grocers. And because there were absolutely no laws governing what could be sold as food, capitalism found a terrifying optimization loop. It is a fundamental rule of business that if you can reduce the cost of your raw materials, your profit margins increase. In the Victorian era, this logic was taken to its absolute deadly extreme, resulting in the systemic adulteration of almost everything people consumed. Let us start with the most basic staple of human existence: bread. In the 19th century, white bread was a status symbol. Dark bread was for the poor, white bread was for the wealthy. But pure white flour was expensive. So the bakers engineered a chemical hack. They bought cheap, rotting, low-quality flour and mixed it with a chemical called alum. Alum is an aluminum-based compound used in the textile industry for dyeing clothes. When added to bread dough, alum acts as a bleaching agent, instantly turning brown, rotten flour into a bright, unnatural white. It also allowed the bakers to pump the dough full of extra water, making the bread heavier so they could charge more by weight. But alum destroys the human digestive system, causing chronic malnutrition and severe bowel issues. And alum was just the beginning. To increase the weight even further, bakers would mix in plaster of Paris pipe clay and even crushed animal bones. The working class of London was literally eating the architecture of the city mixed into their daily loaf. But the glitches in the system went much deeper than bread. Consider the British obsession with tea. Tea was heavily taxed and highly profitable. So the grocers developed a horrifying recycling program. They would buy used, exhausted tea leaves from the back doors of wealthy houses and hotels. They would take these wet, rotting leaves, dry them out on hot copper plates, and then dye them to look fresh. To get the perfect green color for green tea, they used poisonous copper carbonate. To make it look like expensive black tea, they used a mixture of sheep dung and black lead. Millions of people were unknowingly drinking toxic heavy metals every single afternoon. But perhaps the most horrifying system failure occurred in the manufacturing of candy. In the 1850s, sugar was still a relatively expensive commodity. Candy makers looking to cut costs would routinely mix their sugar with a substance they called daft. Daft was essentially powdered limestone, or plaster of Paris. It had no taste, it was heavy, and it made the candy cheaper to produce. It was a known, acceptable fraud within the industry. But in 1858 in the town of Bradford, this glitch turned into a mass casualty event. A local candy maker sent his assistant to the pharmacy to buy 12 pounds of Daft to mix into a batch of peppermint lozenges. The pharmacist's assistant went into the storeroom, but instead of grabbing the barrel of plaster of Paris, he made a fatal error. He grabbed a barrel of arsenic trioxide. Arsenic looks exactly like plaster of Paris, a fine white powder. The assistant sold 12 pounds of pure, highly toxic arsenic to the candy maker. The candy maker mixed it into the sugar and created hundreds of poisoned peppermint lozenges. He noticed the candy looked a bit strange, but sold it anyway at the local market. Within hours, the children of Bradford started collapsing in the streets. 20. People died in agonizing pain, and over 200 were severely poisoned. The Bradford Sweet Poisoning was the ultimate fatal error in an unregulated system. The food supply had become so reliant on fake synthetic fillers that a simple inventory mistake turned a candy stall into a weapon of mass destruction. And the poisoning was not limited to accidents. Candy makers deliberately used lethal chemicals to make their treats more visually appealing to children. To get a bright, vibrant red, they used red lead. To get a brilliant yellow, they used lead chromate. To get a rich green, they used copper sulfate. They were literally painting sweets with heavy metals. The Victorian child was navigating a biological minefield every time they entered a sweet shop. So how did this system finally get patched? It required whistleblowers who were willing to look at the food supply through the lens of hard science. A chemist named Frederick Ackham was one of the first to publish a book exposing these practices, calling it a system of slow poisoning. But he was run out of the country by the powerful food lobbies. The real debug of the system came from a doctor named Arthur Hill Hassall. Hassall realized that chemical tests could be fooled, but a microscope could not. He began putting everyday food items under the lens and publishing drawings of exactly what he saw. He showed the public the literal pipe clay in their bread, the iron filings in their tea, and the toxic dyes in their candy. His undeniable visual evidence finally forced the British government to act. They passed the first comprehensive Food and Drug Acts, essentially writing the first lines of regulatory code to patch the deadly glitches in the free market. The story of Victorian food fraud is a terrifying reminder that without strict regulatory parameters, the relentless drive for profit will inevitably compromise the integrity of the system. It proves that sometimes the most dangerous glitches are not in our machines, but in the very fuel we use to keep ourselves alive.